Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about sort of a secondary part to competition and conflict that we introduced on Thursday of last week. So on Thursday, we discussed Mexican political parties and a little bit of how the political system in Mexico works, including elections. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about civil society in Mexico. Tomorrow, you guys will have a little bit of information, just kind of a quick overview because it's not included on the exam, a little bit of information about the political economy of Mexico. And then on Wednesday, you guys are going to do your Harkness for me over Flipgrid. And then Friday, you will have an assessment, which will be an FRQ, either an argument FRQ or a quantitative FRQ. I will make up my mind probably tomorrow and let you know in our next lesson. But today what I'm going to do is some very, very brief notes. This really isn't very much at all. And just kind of giving you an overview of civil society in Mexico. Now, know that I am greatly simplifying this and we could go into a heck of a lot more detail. But I do think it's important for you to know. So, broadly, the first thing I want to do is read you a quote from a former foreign minister in Mexico who wrote that it should not be altogether surprising that after nearly 500 years of a strong state, civil society should be weak. From this perspective, Mexicans are disorganized because an all-powerful state has crowded them out. So this minister, member of the Mexican government, was basically saying, look, historically, Mexicans haven't really had the freedom to organize in sort of free and voluntary associations that mark civil society. If you think about the Spanish Empire, that really limited people's ability to organize. If you think about the early Mexican state and the various quasi-dictatorships that emerged with early leaders, you can see the same thing. And then if you think about like under the Porfiriato, etc. And then if you think about the modern Mexican state with the dominance of the PRI, there really wasn't a free and open civil society. But things have changed. So Mexico has a strong history of corporatism, where there are organizations that appear to be voluntary civil society organizations, but they're not. They're organized through the state or largely through the PRI for a very, very long time. And that is still, unfortunately, very much the case. A lot of things, pardon me, I'm thirsty, are still organized through the state or through the PRI or major political parties, but there are organizations that exist outside of it. And these organizations are becoming more distinct, are becoming more powerful, and have been doing this since really the 1980s. In major cities in Mexico, particularly in DF, political parties are the primary means of civil society organization. Only about 85% of the Mexican population in a survey said that they belong to no civil society organizations. That means that they don't belong to, or at least they didn't feel that they belonged to any civil society organizations. Remember that civil society organizations are everything from your church or faith community, or a voluntary sports team that you're a part of, or like a professional organization. So for 85% of Mexicans to say that they have no connections to civil society is concerning. But those that do find them mostly through political organizations, and these political organizations are sort of continuing to take a page out of the Book of the PRI, which means that these political parties often will do things like sponsor sports teams or youth activities. They'll sponsor celebrations. It's not uncommon to find that here in the United States either, that you might find a picnic sponsored by like the Young Republicans or something like that. But it is unusual to have the idea of like, the Democrats would like sponsor your T-ball team. Like that's not really a thing we do here. But it is fairly common in Mexico. But while civil society might be weak in Mexico in comparison to other countries, it is growing. First and foremost, one thing that I would point out is that there is a diversity in religious organizations that's accelerating in Mexico. This isn't in the notes, but I think it's important to note that historically, of course, Mexico has a strong tradition of Catholicism. Now, that variation of Catholicism is markedly different from, say, like the Catholicism that you find in the Vatican, but that's a different matter altogether. But what you have seen, especially since the 1970s, 1980s, is an increase of Mexicans converting to evangelical Christianity, particularly branches of evangelical Christianity like Jehovah's Witness or Pentecostalism is really, really common. And so the fact that you're seeing those sort of churches organize and develop in Mexico without a lot of state interference at all and sort of kind of opening up in societies indicates that broadly, on a legal basis at least, civil society is open. You also have seen since the 1990s and early 2000s a flourishing of the creation of anti-cartel organizations or groups that are seeking to end cartel violence or that are trying to seek the end of violence against women, something that has been named in Mexico as femicide. Actually, there was a massive protest in Mexico City on March 9th or 8th or 9th of this year, just, a month or so ago. About femicides, where women in Mexico are subject to a whole lot more violence and disappearance than women in other developed nations. And this protest was set to mark that and to kind of criticize the government's inactivity with regards to that. In general, what we've seen especially since about 1996, is a number of civil society organizations that have tried to step in and fill the places where the government is failing to take care of its citizens. And in some cases, this may or may not take the sort of position of vigilantism. So what we're seeing is in that places like Michoacan. So Michoacan was subject to a heck of a lot of violence from a group called the Knights Templar, which is it's a drug trafficking organization. It's a criminal gang, and people in Michoacan formed their own militia to kind of fight back the Knights Templar, and they did a pretty good job of it. But the state isn't really thrilled because they're not authorized to use the sort of force that they're using. And so they're extra legal enforcers, which means that you got weak rule of law, but you're not having the state step in and fulfill the obligations that it has. So citizens are doing it instead. You also see civil society emerge in NGOs and in professional organization. Mexico has the presence of a lot of NGOs. There aren't really a whole lot of restrictions on that. Of course, they have to go through the normal sort of vetting process that anyone would when operating, but it's not like Russia, where Russia really tries to keep NGOs out. Mexico kind of lets them in. Professional organizations are pretty popular. So like as a teacher, I would be part of a teachers union. I would probably also be part of a number of other professional organizations that would be focused on teaching history or politics. And those sort of organizations are really active, especially in the big cities like in DF. Unions tend to be very powerful in Mexico, and although they've been defanged at various points under various administrations, but the unions that are largely associated with the PRI tend to have the strongest sort of membership and ability to bargain. Strikes are really common in Mexico. Organized collective bargaining is fairly normal. So those are all aspects of Mexican civil society that are pretty important to understand. This right here is a depiction of a protest that was organized through a number of students' rights groups. This right here is in reference to the disappearance and probable murder and possible torture of 43 students at a normal university. A normal university is a teaching college. You've probably heard of this. There were 43 students. They disappeared probably in relation to drug violence and the cartels. And then it seems that the state might have had some sort of role in the cover-up of their death. It's been a really long and complicated story with not a lot of clear government transparency. And this has been a galvanizing factor for a lot of young Mexican students all across the country, that they want transparency, they want clarity about what happened to these young people, and they want the state to turn over information and take responsibility. And thus far, it really hasn't. Now, let's talk a little bit about social cleavages in Mexico. So in Mexico, there are a number of historical divisions. One of the most important is how people think about ethnic and national identity. There's a really excellent quotation with regards to Mexican political history and sort of national identity that basically says that Mexico is a nation that is proud of its indigenous past, but ashamed of its indigenous present. And that has been reflected over and over and over again in a lot of modern scholarship. There's the writings of a very noted anthropologist by the name of Guillermo Bonfield Betaya, who wrote an excellent book called Mexico Profundo, The Deep Mexico, which basically says that indigenous people in Mexico aren't allowed to just be indigenous. It is okay to claim sort of like an indigenous past. In fact, people are very, very proud of that. There's a lot of celebration of this indigenous tradition. But if you are not seen as modern, as assimilated, as mestizo, as having been kind of mixed into the greater Mexican culture, then you're very often seen as lower class. In Mexico, the term for an Indian person, indio, is sometimes used as, depending on the context, can be used as an insult. It's not always a good thing. And you can hear that in kind of the casual way that people talk about this sort of thing. Indigenous populations in Mexico are much, much more likely to be poor, to be the victims of violence, to have fewer infrastructure access points, to have lower wage jobs, to generally speaking have lower levels of education. All of this ultimately has led to kind of an us-them situation. People in positions of power tend to be more likely white or mestizo in Mexico. They tend to be further distant from sort of indigenous culture. And this sort of division in culture and division in economics came to a head in 1994 when in Chiapas, which is a southern Mexican state, you had the development of the EZLN, the Ejército Zapatista de la Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army of the National Liberation. And this movement seized control over a number of cities and towns in Chiapas, and the Zapatistas are still around. What they're seeking is increased autonomy. They don't want to be part of the Mexican state. That isn't to say necessarily that they're seeking full political independence. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. They just kind of want the government to leave them alone, and they don't want the government involved in their lives, partially because they haven't seen the benefits of that. So in 1996, the Mexican government negotiated the San Andres Peace Accords under gosh, was it Zedillo? Must have been. It was Zedillo. But those peace accords have never been put into full, like, actual play. And so as a result, the rebellion continues. Down in Chiapas, the Zapatista army still controls a number of major communities, and they pretty much live isolated from the rest of Mexico. Believe it or not, the Zapatistas were actually very, very popular in Mexico altogether. In 1994 and 95, there were a number of mass protests held in their favor in the Zócalo in Mexico City, where everybody was, chanting "Todos somos, well, hang on, no, not Mexicanos, that would be incorrect. Todos somos Marcos, which sounds ridiculous, but Marcos was kind of the Subcomandante Marcos was the leader of the Zapatistas. So you guys are going to do some more reading for me on the Zapatistas as your final Harkness discussion coming up. So I'm going to pause here and move on to the next video.